Hey folks, so last week I put up a video called Is Starfleet Actually the Bad Guy? And many of you in the comments pointed out a few areas that I could have maybe addressed in the video that were relevant to the topic that I didn't talk about. So I want to talk about a couple of those things in this video, but I didn't really feel like writing a whole second video on this topic. So we're going to half-ass it a little and do this not actually Trek Actually style. So a couple of you mentioned that I could have talked, as long as the subject is things that Starfleet does that don't really reflect all that great on its reputation as an army of heroes and Starfleet officers being the noblest people and the embodiment of evolved humanity and all that stuff. Well, how do you find room for Section 31 and all of that? Doesn't Section 31, just the fact that it exists at all as like a secret intelligence apparatus within Starfleet, that kind of cuts against the whole Starfleet is the good guy thing, doesn't it? So I didn't mention Section 31 like at all. I don't think I even said the term Section 31 once in my video, so that is fair play that I could have at least worked that in. I focused on the attempted forced relocations that Starfleet does not once but twice in the TNG era, in Journey's End, and then also later in Star Trek Insurrection, because I feel like a forced relocation is a pretty, we have a few of those in our American history, right? And those are massive stains. Those are huge, like, moral failings of the United States government. I mean, some of it is so bad that they even bothered to teach us about it in school. Like, the American history in public school is pretty whitewashed in more ways than one. But we at least learn about the Trail of Tears. It was so bad that they had to teach us about it. So that's why I chose to focus on Starfleet's attempted forced relocations of populations, because that's such a dark thing, and there's so many very, very sad, awful precedents for that in actual history. But Section 31, that's a good one. So Section 31 is something I could have talked about. Also, somebody else, a few of you actually brought up how Starfleet and the Federation have this long-standing history of refusing to acknowledge the personhood of synthetic life forms. And this is even after the Measure of a Man episode in TNG's second season, a real dramatic high point of that series and of Star Trek in general, where they established that Data as an android has civil rights and deserves to be treated as an individual, not as property of Starfleet. Even after that, there are multiple instances where androids and then later holographic forms of life are treated as though they don't have civil rights, are treated as though they are not, legally speaking, people with the right to choose. Starfleet attempts to take custody of Data's daughter Lal when he creates her, and Picard even brings up Measure of a Man to the Admiral. He's like, what about what happened in Measure of a Man, dude? He's an individual with the right to have a child if he wants. Anybody else could have a child, and Starfleet wouldn't show up and say, give us the child. What's with this? And the exocomps in a later TNG episode that showed signs of rudimentary intelligence that were still looked at as tools, and Data had to fight for their individuality and their right to not be sacrificed as though they were just mechanisms when they had evolved an actual intelligence. And then, of course, the Doctor in Voyager, who through him we see that Starfleet has not accepted holographic beings, holographic artificial intelligences as legitimate people, that the Doctor has to actually fight for his rights as a person, even among the Voyager crew that know him, and you would think they would all be on board with the fact that, yeah, the Doctor is obviously a person and deserves rights. He has to fight for some of them to treat him as a person. So when you look at that, the Starfleet Federation ban on synths actually makes a lot of sense. Not morally, it's a horrible thing to do, but it's even more consistent with Starfleet's character than I presented in my video, because they have a specific history overlooking or denying the rights of synthetic beings in terms of androids and in terms of holographic people. So yeah. And also someone else mentioned discrimination against genetically engineered people. And this goes beyond banning genetic engineering, because the explanation that is given in Dr. Bashir, I presume, the episode of Deep Space Nine where this is all sort of brought up, makes sense. You can understand after the augments, although they weren't called the augments yet because they hadn't done those Enterprise episodes, but Khan and his followers, his genetically engineered supermen, taking over Earth and having to be sort of banished into space. You can understand why after that, the governments of Earth might say, okay, no more genetic engineering. Like, that part makes sense, to ban genetic engineering. But then they also take the further step of saying, and if you do happen to be a genetically engineered person, you cannot be a part of Starfleet. Like, you are banned from service in Starfleet, and they have to make an exception for Dr. Bashir so he can remain in Starfleet after his heritage, his not his heritage, but his history as a genetically modified person is brought to light. So that's discrimination against genetically engineered people as well, is something that Starfleet and the Federation apparently have a long history of. And then this is another one. I mentioned the evil admirals, but I didn't quite make the point that the mere fact that there are so many evil admirals in Starfleet, that in and of itself, whether you look at them and you say, oh, it's an admiral that's gone rogue, it's an admiral that, was acting without official sanction from Starfleet as a whole, or from Starfleet Command, or was acting without the knowledge or the consent, the knowing consent of the Federation Council or whatever. Just the mere fact that there are so many evil admirals in Starfleet, and they make trouble for our heroes so often, speaks to some pretty serious institutional problems that Starfleet has, and that beyond Starfleet, that the Federation government has. Because why are these evil people able to rise to high levels, to high ranks in Starfleet and high offices in the Federation so often, and gain such influence that they can put their diabolical plans into motion? And if it weren't for the crew of the Enterprise or Deep Space Nine or whoever to stop them, they would get away with it. They would be able to do these terrible things that they want to do. So that regardless of whether their plots are officially sanctioned or not, the fact that there are so many evil admirals is an institutional problem for Starfleet that points to the fact that actually maybe it's not as benevolent as it says it is, and as a lot of fans insist that it is when they react badly to it being portrayed as a little bit more complicated, morally speaking, in Discovery, or especially in Star Trek Picard. So I wanted to spend most of the rest of this video talking about the evil admirals, and one evil admiral in particular. But first, I thought it would be fun to do a poll. So I put up a poll on Twitter, and also the same poll with the same options on YouTube, on my YouTube community page. And the question was, who is the worst evil admiral? And because Twitter only gives you 4 options, a maximum of 4 options for polls, I chose 4 evil admirals from throughout Star Trek history to let people vote for who they think was the worst one. And the ones I chose were Admiral Satie from the Drumhead, Admiral Pressman from the Pegasus, Admiral Layton from Homefront on Deep Space Nine, and then also Admiral Marcus from Star Trek Into Darkness. Those were the 4 options on the poll in both YouTube and Twitter. And on Twitter, Admiral Marcus won by 34%. Second place was Admiral Satie with 30%. So Marcus edged Satie out by 4%. And Pressman finished last with just under 12%. So Layton was in third place there. And on YouTube, same options, but different results. Satie actually won with 34%, and then second place was Marcus with 32%. Third place was Layton with 23%, and then last place was Pressman, again with about 12% of the vote. And there were a couple of admirals that I actually left off the poll because, again, with Twitter, you only get 4 options. So there were a few that I would have mentioned or would have had as a choice if the poll had just had more options. And the big one that I left off was Admiral Cartwright, who we see, I think, for the first time in Star Trek 4. I don't think he's in Star Trek 3, but he's in Star Trek 4. And then he comes back in Star Trek 6, where it turns out he's a traitor. Cartwright is one of the conspirators who is behind the assassination of Klingon Chancellor Gorkon, and is also planning to assassinate the president of the Federation and frame the Enterprise for killing the Chancellor, and Kirk and McCoy end up having to go to Rura Penthe, and it turns out that Cartwright was one of the conspirators behind that, and he was a very, very high-ranking admiral who was mixed up in that. So he's a big one. He's a big-time evil admiral that deserves to be mentioned if we're talking about evil admirals. There's also Admiral Kennelly, who was in an episode, actually the first Ensign Rowe episode of TNG, and he had a secret agreement with Cardassians to try and frame Bajoran terrorists for something that they didn't do. So he conspired with Cardassians against the Bajorans, and that's pretty bad for, a Starfleet admiral to do. And a lot of people in comments said, why didn't you mention Admiral Nechayev, and why didn't you mention Admiral Clancy? And Admiral Clancy is the admiral from Star Trek Picard. And the reason I didn't mention them is because I don't think they're evil admirals. I think they are antagonists to our heroes, and I think you could say, especially in the case of Nechayev, and I guess in the case of Clancy too, from what we see of her, that they are voices for the Starfleet company line, and if Starfleet is doing something questionable, they, of course, are part of that because they are carrying it out. And Nechayev seemed really preoccupied with Starfleet security, and we've seen lots of instances in fiction and in real life where abuses and crimes committed by the state or by agents of the state were justified by saying, we did it for security, we did it to keep America safe, or we did it to keep the Federation safe. So Nechayev seems like one of those. And so does Clancy. But they're not rogue admirals, and they're not villains in the story in any sense. They were women who weren't nice to Picard. And if I'm honest, I think that's about 75% of why a lot of fans, not everybody, but a lot of fans react so negatively to them, because Nechayev and Clancy were these two women who got up in Picard's face and bossed him around and didn't like him and weren't friends with him. And, I think a lot of people, especially a lot of men, who identify with Picard or see Picard as a hero, didn't take too kindly to seeing some woman come in and try to boss him around. So I think that's a lot. Not all of it, and I'm not saying if you didn't like Nechayev that you're automatically a misogynist or whatever. I'm saying, statistically speaking, you probably are a misogynist, okay? But I'm giving you an out. You aren't necessarily one. So I very deliberately did not include them in discussions of evil admirals, because I don't think they count. And now let's talk about Pressman, because Pressman is the one I want to spend the rest of the video talking about, because he's one of my favorite evil admirals. In fact, of all the evil admirals we see in Star Trek, Pressman might be my favorite. He did finish last in both of the polls that I put up, but that does not mean that he deserves to be left off the hook. In fact, because he got the smallest number of votes in both of those polls, I feel like I need to remind everybody of what he did that was so bad and why he was such an asshole. So let's talk about Pressman and what he did that made him such an asshole as we discuss the episode where we found out about all this, which was a Season 7 TNG episode called The Pegasus. And before we get into the Pegasus, modesty does compel me to tell you that even though this is a Trek Actually video, and it is not scripted like, it is a not actually Trek Actually video. See, if it was scripted, I would have got that right. Proof, evidence. It is a not actually Trek Actually video, which means I didn't script it word for word. I'm making most of this up in the moment, extemporaneously. But I did write this next bit down. So modesty compels me to tell you that what you're about to see, the amusingly off-kilter yet insightful episode summary you are about to watch, is something that I did write down ahead of time. It's not just me riffing off the top of my head, because I'm good, but I'm not that good. It's Captain Picard Day! Kind of a weird cold open for a Riker episode, but Okay. The kids on the ship do little art projects to show their appreciation for Captain Picard because they look up to him as a role model, and he seems kinda annoyed with it. But then in the next scene, Riker is like, so who won the art contest? And Picard's like, oh, it was this kid who did a sculpture of my head. It was kinda neat. Almost as if, yeah, he's not totally comfortable with it, but he also gets it and doesn't all the way hate it because Picard's evolving attitude toward children was an obvious part of his character development throughout the series, which means it's not out of character for a much older Picard to form a parental-like bond with a child like the one we see between him and Elnor in Star Trek Picard, and maybe everyone who complained about how that was out of character for Picard just needed to go back and watch some old episodes to refresh their memories of what Picard was actually like the producers of Star Trek Picard obviously did. And also, even if it wasn't a natural continuation of a previously explored character arc, which it was, maybe Picard's mentorship of young Elnor is a sign that he has changed in the years since we last saw him, which would be a valid choice for a writer to make when revisiting a character after such a long hiatus, and maybe we as audience/critics should give those writers enough space to tell the story they want to tell, watch and see what the series has to show us about Picard at this point in his life, then decide whether we think it works or not, instead of just identifying things that don't match our expectations and marking them wrong as though we're grading a test. Anyway, Riker's like, haha, the kids made art of you. And Picard goes, yeah, that's pretty funny. Commander Riker Day is next month. The Enterprise has been given a super secret mission, and they rendezvous with another starship so that someone from Starfleet Intelligence can come aboard and brief them on the mission, and the Starfleet Intelligence person turns out to be this guy, Admiral Eric Pressman, who once upon a time was the captain of the USS Pegasus, which was Riker's first assignment after graduating from the Academy. And Pressman jumps down off the transporter pad and goes, guess what, Will? The Pegasus! She's still out there! And we're gonna go get her! And Riker gets this look on his face like, oh, great. So the Pegasus was lost in an accident a long time ago, but it turns out it's still intact and has recently been detected somewhere in the Devlin system. Starfleet wants to find it because it has a whole bunch of mysterious experimental technology on it, really valuable stuff that the Romulans want to get their hands on too, so the Enterprise has got to find it first. While Data looks for the Pegasus in an asteroid field, Pressman and Riker have a drink and a chat in 10 Forward. And Pressman's like, so how long have you had that beard? And Riker says, oh, a few years. You know, it's the strangest thing. As soon as I grew it, everything around here started to get way more interesting. Maybe you should grow one. And Pressman's like, me with a beard? Hard to imagine. I can see myself with a mustache, though. Pressman and Riker start talking vaguely about what happened to the Pegasus back then. Pressman's like, if we find the ship, we can resume the ominous secret experiments we were running before it all went tits up and everyone died. And Riker says, are you sure that's a good idea? And Pressman says, yep, and the chief of Starfleet Security thinks so too. She's backing this operation all the way, but also it's top secret, so don't tell anybody about this, even Captain Picard. Cut to a little later, and Captain Picard's like, hey, what's going on? And Riker's like, oh, I can't tell you, sorry. And Picard says, I read a report about what happened to the Pegasus, and it said that not only was it destroyed, but there was also a mutiny on board. And after it was all over, and the ship was thought destroyed, and Pressman and you and a few others were the only survivors, the judge advocate who investigated it thought that you and Pressman were conspiring to cover up the truth of what really happened? So you want to tell me about that? And Riker's like, sorry, can't talk about it. And Picard's like, okay, just don't let him do anything that'll get all of us killed. And Will, if it comes down to a choice between me and him, remember, he might be an admiral, but he's also a guest star. They find the Pegasus, and it's inside an asteroid sticking halfway out of the rock face. That's weird. Pressman's like, yeah, weird, how'd that happen? I have no idea. Come on, Will, let's beam over. So they fly the Enterprise into the asteroid through this big cave, and Riker and Pressman beam over to the engine room of the Pegasus. Pressman opens up a panel and goes, Eureka! It's still here! And Will looks around and says, yeah, and look at all the dead people we used to work with. And Pressman says, well, they brought it on themselves, the disloyal dipshits. Screw them! Come help me with this thing. And Riker's like, oh, this is why the kids never made art of you! And now the Picard-centered cold open makes sense. Because that's how writing works. Anyway, Riker tells Pressman, nope, I'm out. You're not going to do to the Enterprise what you did to the Pegasus. I was wrong to help you back then, and I'm not going to help you now. Pressman's like, fine, whatever, just keep your mouth shut. And they beam back to the Enterprise with this piece of equipment Pressman yanked out of that panel. The Romulans show up and cave in the entrance to the asteroid, trapping the Enterprise inside. Picard's like, well, this sucks. Then Riker pipes up with, I know how we can get out of the rock. We can use the thing Admiral Pressman just salvaged from the Pegasus. It's an illegal cloaking device that also allows you to fly the ship through solid matter. And Pressman's like, traitor! And Riker's like, whatever, dude, read the jersey. I'm Team Picard. See, back in the day, the Federation signed a treaty with the Romulans where it promised not to develop cloaking technology. But Pressman and some other people in Starfleet were like, screw that. Let's just make a cloaking device anyway and not tell anybody. But let's also make it so you can fly through solid stuff with it. And so that's what they did. They hook the phasing cloaking device up to the Enterprise and use it to fly the ship out of the asteroid. Then Picard orders Pressman to be arrested, and Pressman's like, this will not stand. I have a lot of friends at Starfleet Command who support what I was trying to do here. Remember that, viewers of future spin-offs that present Starfleet in a less than flattering light. This has all been established. Kurtzman isn't just making it up. And that's all I wrote down about that episode. That's pretty much it. There's a little bit at the end where Riker turns himself in to be court-martialed because he was part of the conspiracy with Pressman to hide the truth about the cloaking device, but then Picard comes and talks to him and he's like, yeah, but I mean, you told the truth when it happened and they'll probably ask you some questions about it, and look, this is never going to be mentioned again, so let's just go back to work. And they leave the brig together and that's it. Riker gets away with another crime. But I let him get away with it and I don't hold it against him because he's one of my favorite characters. That's how bias works. So, yeah, and the thing about what Pressman did that was so bad and also so, I think, representative of the evil Admiral trope in Star Trek is he was willing to just set aside not only Starfleet's principles, not only Starfleet's ideals, but actual legal documents that Starfleet had enacted. There was a treaty between Starfleet and the Romulan Star Empire that kept them from going to war with each other. And one of the very, very important parts of that treaty was Starfleet promising not to develop cloaking technology. And Pressman said, screw that. Doesn't apply to me. I don't think we should have done that, so I'm going to pretend we didn't do it, and me and some of my friends are going to develop cloaking technology plus a phase cloaking technology that'll give us an even greater strategic advantage over the Romulans. We're just going to do it anyway because that's what we think needs to be done. And that is a very, very common trait shared by a lot of the different, what I call the evil admirals or the rogue admirals that we meet throughout Star Trek. Cartwright, you could say was something similar. And Marcus certainly, these politicians, these council members, these bureaucrats, these people who have never been out there, who've just been stuck behind a desk their whole career, they don't know what it's really like. They're not willing to do what needs to be done. But I, Admiral Cartwright, or I, Admiral Pressman, I will break the rules. I will do what needs to be done to preserve our way of life, right? That's the ultimate justification. That's something I don't think Pressman ever says that, but he strongly implies that he did this to give the Federation what he thought of as a very needed advantage over an enemy that posed a very serious threat to the Federation, to our way of life. I was just doing what was best, not for me, for Starfleet, for the Federation, for the people. That level of self-justification of, yes, I broke the rules, I did the wrong thing, but I did it for the right reason. That's totally what Pressman does. And it's what a lot of the evil admirals do. So I think Pressman is a really, really great example of an evil admiral. And I also think that the Pegasus is one of the best episodes of TNG, and it's one of my favorite episodes. And I've wanted to do a tongue-in-cheek episode summary of it for a long time, and I finally decided to just say screw it and do it in this video. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope that I managed in my meandering, insufficient way to at least touch on a few of the other things about why Starfleet isn't always such a heroic organization that I didn't mention in the first video. I hope I at least got around to mentioning a few more of them in this video, even though admittedly I didn't really go into a whole lot of depth in exploring them. But hey, not actually Trek actually. Yeah, talk about self-justification. God, I would be a great evil admiral, wouldn't I? Anyway, that's it for this video, everybody. I want to remind you once again, as I always do, patreon.com/Steve Shives to support this channel and support this work that I do here when I talk about Star Trek and all the other videos that I do. Also, don't forget the Ensign's Log, the Star Trek-themed comedy podcast that myself and the awesome Jason Harding co-host. Links in the description if you want to listen to that if you haven't checked it out before. And I will be back next week for the special sort of unscheduled bonus Trek Actually video about who is actually the best and the worst parent in Star Trek. So that'll be a lot of fun. And yeah, until then, take care everybody, be safe, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.